The first time my uncle called me greedy, he did it in front of 6 people. A dead woman's portrait, and a probate attorney billing by the hour. I didn't correct him. That was what seemed to disappoint Victor Hale most. Not that I looked stunned. Not that I'd gone pale when he said it. Not even that I'd arrived alone in the same navy coat I wore to my grandmother's hospital discharge meeting 3 months earlier, the one no one else in that room had bothered to attend. No, Victor wanted a reaction. A defense. A tremor. A raised voice. Something he could point at and say, "There." That's what Elena Marlowe has been waiting for all along. Instead, I folded my hands in my lap and looked at the envelope on Simone Kessler's desk. That was the envelope that mattered. Cream stock. Thick. Old-fashioned. My grandmother Nora Hale would have liked that. Nora believed paper should feel serious if the truth inside it was going to rearrange lives. We were sitting in a private conference room in Concord, Massachusetts. Dark wood shelves. Frosted glass. A tray of untouched coffee going bitter in the corner. Rain ticking softly against the window, as if the weather understood it had been cast in something theatrical and tasteful. Victor had come in loud. That was his style. He entered with Ruth, his wife, already speaking. Already filling the air with the polished indignation of people who believe volume can establish innocence before facts arrive. Victor smelled like cedar cologne and old entitlement. Ruth had on pearls the size of small accusations and the expression of a woman preparing to be generous in defeat even before she'd technically won. I knew that expression. I'd seen it my whole life. It's the face relatives make when they've already decided the quiet one should be grateful just for being in the room. Simone Kessler, the executor and attorney, sat at the head of the table with the kind of stillness you only get from people who've watched families destroy themselves in legal offices for decades and no longer confuse emotion with evidence. Then there was Graham Pike, my grandmother's financial advisor. Invited in only because the estate was more complicated than Victor wanted it to be. Graham did not look at anyone longer than necessary. Men like Graham survive by becoming professionally forgettable until the exact second remembering becomes expensive. And then there was me. Elena Marlova, 32, single. A restorer at the Regional Museum in Lexington. The niece, everyone in the family described as bright but difficult, because I had spent the last 10 years making the unforgivable mistake of noticing things. I noticed who visited, who called, who signed, who stalled, who hovered around Nora only when the subject of the house came up. My grandmother Nora Hale had died 12 days earlier. And before you ask, yes, I loved her. Not in the ornamental family way. People love old women after they become photographs and recipes and inherited china. I mean in the practical way. Medication charts, grocery lists, winter tires, replacing the smoke detector batteries, because Nora insisted she could still reach with the step stool and absolutely could not. I knew how many sugars Nora had in her tea by the sound of the spoon against the cup. I knew which pharmacy tech she trusted. I knew the exact week Victor stopped coming by once he realized Nora's forgetfulness was intermittent. Not complete enough to sign anything sloppy without witnesses. That last part mattered. Mic drop? Here it is. Families don't call the useful granddaughter greedy until the useful granddaughter is suddenly sitting too close to paperwork. Simone began formally. "Thank you all for coming," Simone said. "As executor, I'll be reviewing Nora Hale's final will and attached instructions." Attached instructions. Victor twitched at that phrase. Small movement. Important one. Because Victor had spent the last week acting like the will reading was a formality. He'd said things like, "We all know what Mother wanted," and "Let's not make this uglier than grief already has." Which in our family meant, the person most eager to skip structure is usually the person who benefits from vagueness. Victor leaned back in his chair and gave me the first real look of the morning. "You know," Victor said, smiling without warmth, "it says something that Elena made sure to be here in person." Ruth gave a little laugh. She probably thought, sounded light. I said nothing. Victor kept going. Some of us are grieving, and some of us are apparently here to inventory. There it was. First cut, public, measured, still. I said nothing. Victor took my silence as invitation. Elena's always had a special interest in what other people leave behind. Victor said, furniture, documents, and antique. Attention. Ruth murmured. Victor, in the exact tone wives use when they want credit for restraint without actually interrupting anything useful to them. I kept my eyes on the envelope, because that was the thing about men like Victor Hale. They only get bolder when the room still belongs to implication. The second paper opens. They become much less poetic. Then Simone said, I'd suggest everyone save commentary until the reading is complete. Professional. Neutral. Sharp enough to register. Victor smiled at Simone as if indulging her naivete. Of course. Victor said. Then he looked back at me. I just think it's important to say out loud what everybody can see. Elena's been circling this estate for years. That was a lie. But not the kind you can kill quickly. The dangerous kind. The kind built from posture. Family myth. Selective memory. I had been circling Nora. Yes. Her appointments. Her leaking roof. Her stubborn refusal to stop driving after dusk. Victor translated caregiving into opportunism, because opportunism was the only motive he himself respected. I finally looked at him. Not angry. Just clear. Victor mistook that for hesitation and went in for the knife. Don't do that innocent face now. Victor said. It's ugly enough to be greedy. It's worse to pretend you're not. There it was. The word, greedy, dropped into the room before the will had even been opened. Before Nora's voice had been allowed in at all. Before Simone had broken the seal. And that was the humiliation. Really not the insult itself. But the timing. Victor was trying to pre-write the moral narrative in front of witnesses. If I inherited anything, I was greedy. If I questioned anything, I was greedy. If I defended myself, I was greedy and hysterical. Classic structure. Make truth look like appetite before the facts arrive. I rested my palms flat against my knees so no one could see that my hands had gone cold. Then Simone opened the envelope. Paper slid against paper. Rain tapped the glass. Somewhere in the hallway, a copier started and stopped. And before Simone had even reached the second page, I knew by the way Victor's confidence sharpened. By the way Graham Pike sat too still. By the strange extra thickness of the document stack that whatever Victor thought he'd come to collect. My grandmother, Nora Hale, had not left the room unarmed. If you asked my family to describe me before Nora died, they would have said I was helpful. That word sounds kind. It isn't. Not always. In families like mine, helpful is what they call the person whose labor they rely on, while making sure that labor never hardens into authority. Helpful means available. Helpful means discreet. Helpful means intelligent enough to solve problems, but not important enough to be publicly credited for solving them. That was me. Elena Marlova. My mother died when I was 11. My father remarried badly. Then moved to Arizona with his second wife, and a version of himself that became unreachable to anyone who needed steadiness more than charm. By the time I was 24, my closest real relative was my grandmother Nora Hale. Not because Nora was soft, but because Nora was exact. She liked clean edges, punctual plumbers, and women who knew the difference between sentimental nonsense and actual reliability. That last preference was why Victor Hale hated me long before the will reading. Victor was Nora's only surviving son. My uncle, real estate broker, church deacon, perpetual wearer of expensive loafers and moral language. Victor had the kind of public charisma that convinces mediocre men they are guardians of order. He sent broad holiday emails signed with Bible verses and forgot birthdays that weren't strategically useful. He called his mother Ma in a tender voice when other people were around and impossible the minute she needed a second appointment in the same week. Ruth Hale, his wife, was worse in quieter ways. Ruth never insulted directly, if implication would do the work more elegantly. Ruth had spent 20 years arranging herself beside Victor as proof that control could be upholstered tastefully. At funerals, Ruth squeezed hands. At medical visits, Ruth developed scheduling conflicts. At Christmas, Ruth sent orchard pears and asked Nora whether the old silver had been sorted yet. Like inventory was just another dialect of care. Then there was me. I restored damaged colonial portraits, gilt frames, and paper artifacts for a museum. No one in my family could ever quite explain at dinner. Victor used to introduce me as the art one, which sounds charming until you realize it was his way of reducing an entire profession to decorative eccentricity. Families do that when your work is careful and underpaid, but your mind makes them uneasy. The truth was, my job trained me for exactly the kind of life Nora ended up needing near the end. Restoration work is patient work. Evidence work. You do not guess what was once there. You examine layers. You test solvents. You learn which damage is old, which is fresh, which crack is structural, and which stain was added later by somebody hoping nobody would look too closely. That is also a useful way to survive relatives. Mic drop? Here it is. Victor thought Elena was the niece who fixed old things. What Victor never understood was that Elena's real skill was identifying what had been tampered with. Nora began leaning on me gradually. First, it was errands. Then, tax files. Then the orthopedic consult after she slipped on the back steps one February and claimed she was fine while her wrist was swelling under her wool coat like rising bread. Victor helped in highly visible ways. Christmas wreaths. One dramatic hospital bouquet. A loudly performed roof inspection after a nor'easter. I handled the things that actually determine whether an old woman remains safe. Médication, réconciliation. Insurance coding disputes. Hearing aid batteries. Contractor fraud. The dangerous optimism of men who say, that beam's probably fine, after glancing up once from the foyer. Nora's house in Concord had been in the family since 1958. White clapboard. Slate walk. Blue hydrangeas in summer. The kind of New England house people describe as lovely bones because they want credit for recognizing value they themselves are not equipped to maintain. Victor wanted the house. Not openly. That would have sounded crude, but I saw it years before Nora died. In the way he always steered conversations toward what upkeep really costs. In the way Ruth asked whether Nora had considered simplifying her affairs. In the way Victor showed up with market comps in an envelope just for information, 6 months after Nora's first cognitive assessment came back normal enough to disappoint him. That assessment matters. Because families tell one story in public and live inside another. The public story was that Victor was worried about Nora aging alone in a large home. The private truth was more granular. Nora was forgetful sometimes. Not incompetent. Sharp enough to know when someone wanted her to feel smaller than she was. Sharp enough to keep her own bank meetings. Sharp enough to ask me, after Victor's second information envelope, whether I thought greed could wear cufflinks. I said yes. Nora laughed for a full minute. That was our relationship. Not syrupy. Not grandchild sentimentality. Nora and I respected the same things. Clarity. Competence. Records. She called me when she needed something checked, because I checked it. Not because I was family. That distinction meant everything. But to everyone else, Victor. Ruth. A few orbiting cousins, I was just the niece who had somehow made herself useful in ways that were hard to mock cleanly. So they did what families always do when one person becomes indispensable without rank. They minimized. Elena was around a lot. Elena was intense. Elena was protective, in a way that probably came from loneliness. Ruth once told a neighbor, in my hearing, that I had a special attachment to old houses and old people. As if my care for Nora were some aesthetic kink instead of the reason Nora's furnace got replaced before winter and her medication list didn't accidentally double her blood thinner. They made me sound emotional because the alternative was admitting I was competent. And competence is threatening when inheritance is somewhere in the walls. By the last year of Nora's life, the environment around her had become tense in the specific way. Families get tense when death is still impolite to mention, but property has begun vibrating just beneath every conversation. Victor suggested family dinners in the house more often. Ruth asked about appraisals, with increasing casualness. Graham Pike's name started appearing more in conversation whenever Victor wanted to sound responsible. And twice I caught Victor in Nora's study with drawers open. He had no reason to be opening. Both times he said he was looking for old tax papers. Both times he left without finding anything. Both times Nora looked at me afterward and said, "He thinks I'm fading faster than I am." She was right. That was the environment walking into Simone Kessler's office that morning. A family already pretending the moral argument had been settled before the paperwork began. An uncle who had mistaken public confidence for legal entitlement. And me, the quiet niece, everyone believed was too peripheral. Too unmarried. Too museum small. Too emotionally awkward to matter in a room where serious people discussed estates. Victor thought the hierarchy was obvious. Owner class. Wife class. Professional class. Then Elena. The helpful one. That was why Victor called me greedy before the envelope was opened. Because men only insult from a place of assumed safety. And I knew, before Simone finished turning that first page, that whatever my grandmother Nora Hale had left behind, Victor had not bothered to imagine a world in which Nora had seen him clearly enough to plan around him. Simone Kessler adjusted her glasses, unfolded the first sheet, and began reading in the flat, exact voice of someone who understood that grief makes people theatrical and paper should not join in. This is the last will and testament of Nora Elise Hale. Victor settled back almost immediately. That told me he thought he knew the shape of the room already. Men like Victor always relax too early when they believe a legal proceeding is just a slower version of entitlement. Simone read through the formal declarations first. Revocation of prior wills. Sound mind. Witness certification. Administrative language. The sort of clauses that make families impatient because they think reality begins only once names and objects appear. Ruth folded her hands over her handbag and gave me one of those little sympathetic glances women reserve for poorer relations. Unmarried nieces. And people they assume are about to be taught their place by documentation. Then Simone reached the distribution section. To my son, Victor Hale. I leave my father's gold pocket watch, my collection of first edition New England travel books, and the sum of $50,000. Victor nodded once. Small. Contained. But there, like a man approving a forecast he had already modeled. Simone continued. To my daughter-in-law, Ruth Hale. I leave my diamond brooch, the silver tea service, and the sum of $25,000. Ruth inhaled softly, then murmured, "That was generous," in the tone of someone already practicing humility for witnesses. Still, no one looked at me directly. Not Simone. Not Graham. Not Victor. That was deliberate. I knew it. Because this was the moment families perform one of their ugliest rituals. They let the lesser person sit in suspense just long enough to feel the hierarchy settle around them before the final little consolation is read aloud. A ring, a painting, some sentimental object small enough to seem loving and unthreatening at the same time. Victor couldn't resist. Before Simone even reached my name, he turned slightly toward me and said, under the guise of softness, "You see, Nora remembered everyone. Remembered everyone. As if I were about to need comfort. As if whatever my grandmother had left me could only belong in the category of remembrance. Not consequence." I said nothing. Then Simone read, "To my granddaughter, Elena Marlova. I leave my field journals, my writing desk, the contents of the blue cedar chest in the upstairs study, and the sum of $10,000. There it was. 10,000. Ruth's mouth did something tiny and pleased before she corrected it. Victor looked almost relieved. Because, in that split second, before the second page appeared, Victor believed the world had returned to its proper proportions. The son got the symbolic masculine legacy, the wife got refinement. The helpful granddaughter got paper, furniture, and a polite little sum no one in the room could call insulting without seeming exactly what Victor had already named me. Greedy. And then Victor made his move. Victor gave a short laugh and leaned back in his chair. Well, he said, loud enough for everyone. I suppose that settles the appetite issue. Simone stopped reading. Not dramatically. Just enough. Victor. Mistaking stillness for permission. Kept going. Elena spent years hovering around the house. And for what? Victor said. $10,000 and a desk. That should tell everyone here what Mother actually thought about opportunism. Ruth said, Victor, please. But with that familiar uselessness, that means continue. Just let me look decent while you do it. Victor looked straight at me then. If you're disappointed, Elena. Now would be a good time to learn the difference between caregiving and inheritance. He said, one is love. The other is greed, dressed up as duty. That was the trigger. Not just the insult. The theft of motive. Because that is what people like Victor do when they know they cannot attack your visible behavior cleanly. They attack why they say you did it. They revise your service into strategy. Your patience into calculation. Your loyalty into premeditated hunger. And he did it in front of witnesses. In front of Simone. In front of Graham. In front of his wife. Under Nora's framed photograph that Simone had placed on the credenza because some families prefer to feel watched by the dead while they divide them. Mic drop? Here it is. Victor didn't just call Elena greedy. Victor tried to launder years of Elena's real labor into a story that made Victor's comfort look earned. My face stayed still. That irritated him. I saw it immediately. Victor wanted flinch. Not stillness. He wanted me to correct him. Because correction can be made to look defensive. He wanted me to cry. Because crying could be called manipulative. He wanted some visible evidence that his version of me had entered my bloodstream. Instead, I looked at Simone and said, is that the end of the page? That changed the air. Victor frowned. Ruth blinked. Graham Pike looked up for the first time all morning, because they all heard what sat underneath the question. Not denial. Not hurt. Not outrage. Structure. I wasn't asking because I was hopeful. I was asking because I had already noticed the paper stack was too thick and Simone's thumb had not moved to the signature section yet. Victor laughed again. But it sounded thinner. Oh, don't do that. Victor said. Don't start performing legal curiosity because you don't like the number. Performing legal curiosity. Interesting phrase from a man who had spent years treating probate as a mood board. I folded my hands again and said, Elena likes complete readings. That one hit him. Because I used my own name the way witnesses do when they want the room to hear identity clearly. Simone glanced at me only once. But it was enough. Professional recognition. Not warmth. Better than warmth. Then Simone said the sentence that broke Victor's rhythm before the real break even came. There is a second page. Simone said. Victor's posture changed. Only slightly. A tightening across the shoulders. A tiny shift of weight. But I saw it. So did Graham. Men who feel secure in outcomes do not react to pagination. Ruth turned to Victor. You said it was standard? And Victor, too quickly, said, it is standard. No, not anymore. Because now everyone in the room understood that Victor had not merely expected the will to favor him. Victor had expected the will to end before further clarification became dangerous. Simone lifted the second page. Rain pressed harder against the glass. The bitter coffee smell in the corner seemed suddenly stronger. Even the office copier in the hallway had gone quiet. As if the building itself were waiting for a better class of truth. And just before Simone began to read, Victor made one final mistake. He looked at me and said, in a voice meant to humiliate, but now unmistakably edged with warning, "Whatever this is, Elena, don't get dramatic." That was when I knew two things at once. First, Victor had seen enough of Nora in private to fear what came next. Second, whatever lived on that second page was not sentimental. It was structural. And Victor Hale had just insulted the wrong woman one page too early. I did not move when Victor told me not to get dramatic. That bothered him more than if I'd thrown the coffee. People like Victor understand conflict as long as they control its shape. He knew how to manage tears. He knew how to sneer at outrage. He knew how to perform patience while a woman overreacted, and then walk out of the room looking like the adult. What he did not know how to survive was restraint. Simone turned the page. I kept my eyes on the paper. Not on Victor. That was deliberate. Because if I had looked at him, even once, Victor would have taken the moment and turned it into relationship. Family tension. Old resentments. Elena being difficult. But the second page was not about our family weather. It was about structure. Nora had known the difference. So did I. Simone began reading. I direct that the residence located at 18 Hawthorne Lane, Concord, Massachusetts, shall not pass through general distribution. Victor sat up, just a few inches. Enough. Ruth turned her head slowly toward Simone, then toward Victor, as if checking whether she had heard correctly, and whether Victor's face could correct it by force of confidence alone. It could not. Simone continued in that same dry, devastating voice. I further direct that said residence, together with all maintenance records, improvement contracts, insurance schedules, and my private archival materials, stored in the upstairs study, shall transfer under separate instruction to my granddaughter, Elena Marlova, Victor Kutin. No. One word. Sharp. Immediate. Ugly. Not grief. Not confusion. Rejection. That told me everything I needed to know. Victor had not merely hoped for the house. Victor had expected it. Enough to interrupt a probate attorney in mid-sentence, like the reading itself had become offensive. Simone did not raise her voice. Victor. Simone said, I'm not finished. Victor ignored her. This is exactly what I meant. Victor said, turning toward the room, as if witnesses were now a resource to be managed. This is undue influence. Elena was in that house constantly. Elena isolated mother. Elena made herself indispensable. Elena knew exactly what she was doing. Ruth reached for his sleeve. Not to stop him. To steady him. Graham Pike finally spoke for the first time in any meaningful way. Victor. Graham said. Let Simone finish. That was the first little crack. Because Graham Pike was not warm. Graham was not sentimental. Graham was the kind of man who conserved language unless the cost of silence had gone up. If Graham was intervening, the room had already shifted further than Victor understood. I still said nothing. Mic drop? Here it is. Victor called Elena greedy because Victor thought accusation could arrive before evidence. The second page arrived anyway. Simone resumed. Provided that Elena Marlowe accepts appointment as steward of the property and executor of the Hawthorne Preservation Trust established under attached Schedule B. There it was. Not just the house. The trust. The real center of gravity. You could feel the room absorb it in uneven waves. Victor heard house and went white with rage. Ruth heard trust and instantly began recalculating social optics. Graham heard steward and stopped looking surprised at all, which meant he had likely seen enough of Nora's planning to suspect something of this scale existed, even if he had not known the final terms. And me? I heard Nora. Not literally. Nothing cheap like that. But I heard her mind in the design. Nora had not given me the house in the vulgar family sense Victor would immediately weaponize. She had structured it. Stewardship. Preservation. Archival materials. A trust. Records. Conditions. Duties. She had translated care into governance. She had seen exactly what Victor would do to any simple gift. So she hadn't left one. Victor laughed then. And it sounded terrible. Oh. Come on. Victor said. Elena? A steward? Elena restores paintings in a back room for tourists and school groups. Elena isn't equipped to manage a historic property. Still, I did not answer him. That silence was becoming its own thing now. Not absence. Pressure. Because every extra sentence Victor spoke while I stayed still made him smaller and me harder to misread. Simone lifted a separate sheet from the folder. Nora anticipated objection. Simone said, that sentence landed like a dropped tray. Victor stopped talking. Simone read on. In the event that Victor Hale contests Elena Marlowe's stewardship on grounds of competence, character, influence, or greed, I direct the executor to review the attached memorandum, dated February 14, witnessed and notarized, documenting my reasons. Ruth actually whispered, "Oh my God." Victor turned toward Graham. "You knew about this?" Graham did not rescue him. I knew Nora was revising her estate logic. Graham said, "I did not know the exact language." Again, careful. Exact. No loyalty theater. Victor looked at me then. I really looked at me. Maybe for the first time in years, without the cushion of assumption. He wanted something from my face shock. Triumph. Smugness. Guilt. Anything he could convert into proof that the whole structure was manipulative. I gave him nothing. Not because I felt nothing. I felt everything. My pulse in my throat. The old familiar fear of being miscast. The humiliations of the last months replaying in fragments. Victor in Nora's study with drawers open. Ruth talking about silver. Victor calling me greedy before Nora's own words had been allowed into the room. But emotion is not the same thing as surrendering the room to emotion. So I folded my hands again and asked Simone the only question that mattered. Is the memorandum part of the file? Victor stared at me like I had struck him. Not because the question was cruel. Because it was procedural. Because in that moment, with his accusation still hanging in the air, and the trust newly visible, I had not defended myself as niece. I had not pleaded as granddaughter. I had not reacted as the humiliated person in the room. I had stepped, silently and completely, into the structure Nora had built for me. And Simone said, yes, and I think, given what's just been alleged, we should read it aloud. Simone unfolded the memorandum with the same care I use when separating varnish from a painted surface that's been darkened for decades. That detail hit me harder than anything Victor had said. Care reveals respect. And respect, in rooms like that, usually means someone knows the paper is dangerous. The memorandum was dated February 14. Notarized. Witnessed. 3 pages. Nora had written it 6 weeks before her second hospitalization, which meant this was not some confused last burst of sentiment manipulated by the niece with the museum job and special attachment to old houses. This was Nora, clear-eyed, structured, deliberate, building a wall in advance and signing it in blue ink. Victor had stopped pretending to be amused. Ruth sat very still now, handbag forgotten in her lap. Graham Pike leaned back slightly and folded his hands. The posture of a man who has realized his morning has turned from a state administration into controlled detonation. Simone began. in the event that anyone questions my decision to appoint my granddaughter, Elena Marlova, as steward of the Hawthorne property and Associated Preservation Trust, I make the following statement freely. In full possession of my faculties, the room changed again, because Nora's voice, not literally, not theatrically, but in its exact moral architecture, had arrived at last. And when a dead woman begins pre-answering the arguments of the living tend to shrink. Simone read on. Elena, us, over the last 9 years, handled the practical obligations of my life with competence, discretion, and patience. Victor made a small sound in his throat. Disgust or disbelief. I couldn't tell which. Simone kept going. Elena coordinated repairs to my furnace in 2018, after Victor failed to return my calls for 3 days. There. First incision. Not emotional. Documented. Specific. Ruth turned toward Victor so slowly it almost looked painful. Simone continued. Elena reviewed and corrected the roofing estimate in 2020, preventing me from signing a contract that would have overcharged by $11,000. Graham glanced at me then. Not warmly. Professionally. Recognition. That was important. Because until that moment, everyone in that room had been sitting inside Victor's preferred family language, hovering. Attachment. Influence. Greed. Nora was replacing it with a different language entirely. Competence. Savings. Prevented. Handle. Mic drop, here it is. Victor tried to make Elena sound like a scavenger circling an old house. Nora's memo described Elena as the only adult who knew how to keep the house from being eaten alive. Simone read the next paragraph. Elena cataloged the contents of my upstairs study at my request when I became concerned. Items were being moved without my permission. Victor went rigid. That sentence didn't just cut. It named suspicion. Not vague family tension. Not misplaced concerns. Moved without permission. Simone paused only once. Just enough to adjust the page. In October of last year, I discovered Victor in my study, opening the lower flat files and desk drawers under the claim that he was looking for tax records. I did not believe him. No one breathed. Victor started to speak. Stopped. Started again. This is absurd. Victor said. Simone didn't even look up. Professional people know that if you feed interruption, you reward it. She went on reading. I asked Elena afterward to photograph the study contents and create an inventory list, which she did with dates, shelf positions, and condition notes. There it was. The first hidden layer. Not just that I was competent. Not just that Nora trusted me. That I had already built records. Because of course I had. Because when you restore objects for a living, inventory is not clerical work. It is defense. It is how you establish before and after. How you prove a thing existed. Where it was. What state it was in. And what changed. Nora had known that. And Victor, suddenly, did too. He turned toward me, as if seeing an entirely different person in the same chair. I kept my expression neutral. Not to be kind. To be accurate. This was not the moment for performance. The memorandum was doing the work. My job was to let it. Simone turned to the second page. Elena also reviewed my annual carrying costs, insurance renewals, and deferred maintenance history at my request. She is the only member of my family who has demonstrated both interest in and understanding of what stewardship of Hawthorne actually requires. That line landed harder than the inheritance itself. Because this was no longer about affection, no longer about favoritism, no longer even about gratitude for companionship. This was Nora asserting, in signed writing, that the house had not gone to me because I was beloved in some vague sentimental way. It had gone to me because I was qualified. That distinction destroys people like Victor. They can survive being disliked. They can even survive being morally judged if the structure still flatters them. What they cannot survive easily is being outranked on competence by the person they've spent years trying to reduce. Victor laughed again. But it had gone thin and ugly. So this is what we're doing, Victor said. We're treating Elena like some kind of estate professional because she made a spreadsheet? No. That was his mistake. Still minimizing. Still reaching for the old hierarchy. I spoke then for the first time since Simone had started the memorandum. Not a spreadsheet. I said, an inventory with photographic indexing, contractor cross-references, and insurance schedule notes. The room went quiet again. That sentence did exactly what I wanted it to do. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was boring in the right way. Specific. Technical. Impossible to sentimentalize. Ruth looked at me differently after that. Not kindly. Not with admiration. But with the first real sign of recalculation. Ruth had just discovered that the niece she thought of as decorative and intense, at some point without Ruth noticing, becomes structurally dangerous. Simone continued. I have chosen stewardship over sentiment because houses like Hawthorne are easily ruined by people who mistake ownership for entitlement. There, Nora. From the page. Putting the blade exactly where it belonged. Victor pushed his chair back a fraction of an inch. Too small for anyone who didn't know him. Huge for me. Because Victor Hale only moved physically when some deeper part of him had already understood he was losing ground. Then Simone added, there is one more section relevant to Elena's appointment. Victor looked at the memorandum, then at the envelope, then at Graham, then, finally, at me, and I knew what was happening. He had come expecting a sentimental contest, maybe an ugly family one. What he had found instead was a chain of records. Observation. Dates. And written judgments, assembled by a woman he thought was fading, and a niece he thought was merely useful. The hidden layer was no longer hidden. Elena had not been hovering around Nora's affairs. Elena had been documenting them, and whatever sat in the final section of Nora's memorandum, Victor had just realized it was probably not written to flatter him. Simone turned to the last section of Nora's memorandum. By then, the room had split into two kinds of silence. Mine was controlled. Victor's was crowded. You can hear the difference if you've spent enough time around people trying not to lose status in real time. Controlled silence holds. Crowded silence leaks. It fills with recalculation. Blâme. Panique. Half-formed counter-arguments. And the frantic search for a cleaner story than the one now sitting in black ink on expensive paper. Victor was already looking for a way out. Not morally. Structurally, I could see it in the way his eyes moved not toward Simone's face, but toward the document stack. Graham Pike's briefcase. The envelope. The door. He wasn't listening as a son anymore. He was auditing exposure. That told me Nora's final section was going to be worse than a preference statement. It was going to be protective. Simone read, in recent years, I have grown concerned not only about neglect, but about pressure. Victor actually shifted in his seat. Pressure. That word changes things in probate rooms. Neglect is sad. Pressure is evaluative. Neglect can be excused as busyness. Es distance. Misunderstanding. Pressure suggests intent. Strategy. Repetition. Someone leaning where they should not lean. Simone continued. Victor has, en multiples occasions, raised the sale value of Hawthorne in my presence after being asked not to. Ruth has inquired repeatedly as to whether my silver, furniture, and personal papers had already been assigned. Ruth went red. Not dramatic scarlet. Just that deep controlled flush women get when social polish can't keep up with blood. And there it was, Nora naming specifics again. Not family tension. Not there were concerns. Actual patterns. Actual language. The exact phrases Ruth had used. Preserved by an old woman, everyone had apparently hoped was fading faster than her memory. Mic drop? Here it is. Victor thought Elena had influence, because Elena was present. What Victor missed was that Nora was still present too, and Nora had been taking notes. Simone lifted the second sheet. I therefore instructed Elena, beginning last autumn, to retain copies of contractor communications, insurance summaries, and any messages related to proposed sale discussions or requests to access my study, records, or locked cabinets. There, the next hidden layer. Not just that I had documented the study, not just that Nora trusted my judgment. Nora had formally tasked me to preserve a pattern. That changes the moral geometry completely. A greedy granddaughter collects things. A competent steward preserves records because the owner asked her to. Victor stared at me. This time he wasn't angry first. He was stunned, because in his mind, I had been reactive, useful, interfering. Maybe. The niece who noticed too much and made errands inconveniently exact. But now, a different possibility had opened in front of him. And I could see the moment it landed. I had not wandered into the center of Nora's affairs by accident. Nora had put me there. Ruth found her voice before Victor did. This is paranoid, Ruth said. Nora was old. Older people become suspicious. Everyone knows that. Bad move. Because weak rebuttals only widen strong suspicion. Simone, to her credit, did not bother answering Ruth directly. She just kept reading. I also instructed Graham Pike to review with me. In Elena's presence, the carrying costs and preservation liabilities of Hawthorne. Because I wished Elena to understand the obligations involved should I decide against sale. Graham Pike looked down once, then nodded very slightly. Not to me. To the paper. Confirmation. Important confirmation. Because now Nora's memorandum was no longer isolated testimony. It touched a second professional witness. Not gossip. Not family memory. A financial advisor. That meant the trust structure likely hadn't appeared late or impulsively. It had been discussed in adult language. With numbers. Liabilities, tax consequences, and long-term stewardship in view. That is the kind of reveal families hate most for Menachans. Not shocking money, not secret children, not melodrama. Competence, cold, documented competence. Victor laughed once, but it sounded broken at the edges. So what now? Victor said. We're pretending Elena is some kind of preservation heiress because she sat in on meetings? No. Still minimizing. Still trying to turn expertise into proximity. I said nothing. That was starting to do real damage. People underestimate silence because they mistake it for emptiness. It isn't. In the right room, after the right document, silence becomes an accusation. No one can interrupt cleanly. Every extra word from Victor made him look more panicked and me more legitimate. Then, Simone read the line that widened the suspicion into something sharper. In the event that any papers are found missing from the upstairs study, or any claim is made that I informally promised sale, transfer, or pre-distribution access to Hawthorne, or its contents, I direct the executor to consult Elena's inventory archive and compare it with the keyed file box stored at Pike and Doyle. The keyed file box. I didn't know about the box. Not specifically. That was Nora's second twist. And it landed so hard, I almost turned my head toward Graham before I stopped myself. Almost. That mattered. Because if I had reacted visibly, Victor would have seen uncertainty and rushed for it. Instead, I kept my face still and let the room think I already knew exactly what Nora had done. Maybe that was unfair. Maybe not. Victor heard it differently than I did. I heard protection. Victor heard backup evidence. You could see it hit him. The little loss of color. The jaw tightening, the sudden stillness of a man reviewing old choices. Because now the suspicion no longer lived only in Nora's memo. It extended outward into another repository, another location, another chain of records outside the house and outside the family. If anything had gone missing, if anything had been copied, if any drawer had been opened too often or too hopefully, there might be a comparison point already waiting. That was the moment the room stopped feeling like a will reading and started feeling like a pre-litigation briefing. Ruth said very quietly, "Victor, note accusation. Not support. Elam." And Victor. For the first time since Simone had opened the envelope, I did not answer her. That silence told me more than anything else could have. Because innocent people in family disputes get loud. Entitled people get indignant. But people who are suddenly calculating whether a dead woman anticipated their future excuses, they go still. Mic drop. Here it is. The second hidden layer was not just that Nora trusted Elena. It was that Nora distrusted Victor enough to leave a trail outside the family's reach. Simone finally lowered the memorandum and said, "There is an attached note regarding stewardship conditions and the file box reference." Victor spoke too quickly. "I'd like to see that now." Of course he would. Not hear it. Say it. Because he was done fighting narrative. He had moved fully into document anxiety. Simone did not hand it over. Instead, she said, "We'll continue in order." And that was when I knew whatever came next was not just going to embarrass Victor. It was going to define exactly how much Nora had seen before she died, and exactly how much trouble Victor was already in if he challenged me. Victor made the mistake powerful men make when they feel paperwork slipping away from them. He stopped performing dignity. Until that moment, Victor had still been trying to operate in two rooms at once, the legal room Simone controlled, and the family room he had always dominated with tone. Interruption. An inherited male confidence. The memorandum had narrowed the gap between those rooms. The keyed file box had nearly closed it. What came next shattered it. Simone lifted the attached stewardship conditions and said, "Bear Nora's instruction. Any challenge to Elena Marlowe's appointment triggers immediate review of preserved records, inventory comparisons, and reimbursement claims associated with unauthorized or unsupported access to the residence." Victor stood up. Not fully. Half out of the chair. Then fully. "You've got to be kidding me." Victor snapped. Ruth whispered, "Victor, sit down." Bad advice. He was past sitting down, because now the issue was no longer whether I had somehow manipulated an elderly woman into liking me more than him. Now, there was a procedural cost to objecting. Nora had anticipated contest. Nora had attached consequences to contest. And Victor, who had entered the room ready to call me greedy before the envelope even opened. I had just learned that his mother knew exactly what kind of son he became when property was involved. That is the kind of insult men like Victor cannot metabolize quietly. Simone did not flinch. As I said earlier, Simone said, "Nora, anticipated objection." Victor jabbed a finger toward the papers. "This is Elena's language. Stewardship. Inventory. Reimbursement claims. This is how Elena talks. You expect me to believe Mother wrote this on her own?" There it was. The old move. Reduce my competence into contamination. If the language sounds intelligent, procedural, precise, then clearly I must have infected the document. Because in Victor's worldview, older women feel things, and men inherit things. They do not build legal architecture around female competence unless some younger woman put the words there. I still didn't answer him. Mic drop? Here it is. Victor could accept that Nora was angry with him. What Victor could not accept was that Nora had respected Elena enough to write in Elena's language. Graham Pike finally opened his briefcase. That sound a zipper. A clasp. Paper moving inside leather should not have felt dramatic. It did. Because Graham Pike was not a man who moved unless movement had been earned. I may be able to help with that point, Graham said. Victor turned on him instantly. Help with what? Graham removed a thin manila folder and placed it on the table with almost insulting calm. With authorship, Graham said. Nora asked me to witness one of her review sessions in January. She spoke at length about stewardship, liability, and maintenance obligations. Those were her terms. Victor, not Elena's. Ruth actually closed her eyes for 1 second. Victor laughed. But now it came out too loud and too fast. Of course you've all got folders. Folders? Yes. That was the problem. Wasn't it? People like Victor survive on fog. Folders are the enemy of fog. Simone looked at Graham. Do you have notes from that session? I do. Graham said. Dated. Not part of the will, but sufficient to establish that Nora's thinking was consistent and independent. Victor pushed his chair back so hard it hit the wall. You've all been building this behind my back. No. Wrong again. That line only works if other people were plotting. What had actually happened was simpler and much worse for him. Victor had assumed nothing serious could happen unless he initiated it. He had mistaken everyone else's restraint for passivity. I said my first sentence in several minutes. Nora built it in front of Victor. Victor just didn't believe Nora could see him clearly. That hit harder than I expected. Because it was true in a way no one in the room could pretend not to understand. Victor had not been excluded from his mother's clarity. He had been judged by it. And suddenly, he was not speaking to Simone anymore. Not to Graham. Not even to Ruth. He was speaking to me. This is because you were always there. Victor said. You made yourself necessary. You wanted mother dependent. There it was again, the only accusation he had left. Need as manipulation. Competence as ambush. But he had started repeating himself now. And repetition is what panic sounds like when it puts on a blazer. I stayed seated and answered calmly. Elena became necessary when Victor kept being absent in ways that were too specific to be accidental. Ruth made a quiet choking sound, like she had swallowed her own objection. Victor swung toward Simone. I want copies of everything. You'll get formal copies through probate procedure. Simone said. I want them now. No. That word landed with a satisfying precision. Victor wasn't used to being told no by women in rooms. He considered his by default. That was the escalation. Not just anger. Loss of control over timing. Over documents. Over narrative. Victor could no longer slow the reading down. Speed it up. Charm around it. Or shame me into a reaction that would make the rest of the room doubt me. He was stuck hearing himself while the paper kept winning. Then came the second twist. Simone turned to the final paragraph of the stewardship conditions and said, in addition, Nora directs that if any challenge is raised on grounds of Elena's greed or alleged manipulation, the executor shall review the household expense log and visitor register Elena kept at Nora's request, beginning November 3, as well as the reimbursement ledger for unpaid support expenditures. Victor went still. Not the earlier calculating stillness. This was sharper, because visitor register and reimbursement ledger are not family words. They are tracking words. And I saw it dawn on him, really dawn, that Nora had not just suspected. Nora had created comparison points. Dates. Presence. Absence. Money spent. Money promised. Money not repaid. All the boring, devastating details. Families love to dismiss until those details become the only things anyone credible is willing to discuss. Ruth said, very softly, Victor, what's in the ledger? He didn't answer. That told Ruth enough. It told me enough too. Maybe Victor had forgotten the small repairs he promised and never reimbursed. Maybe he had forgotten the emergency plumber I paid when Nora's kitchen pipe burst on a Tuesday. He couldn't possibly get away. Maybe he had forgotten the winter tree removal deposit I fronted, because the branch over the garage had started to split and Victor wanted to wait until spring pricing. I hadn't forgotten. Nora hadn't either. Mic drop? Here it is. Victor came to the will reading, expecting a sentimental fight over a house. Instead, he walked into an audit of his own absence. Ruth turned on him then. Just slightly. Did Elena pay for things? Ruth asked. Victor snapped. That's not the point. Wrong. Now, it was exactly the point. Because once reimbursement enters the room, greed gets reclassified. The greedy person is rarely the one who kept the receipts. Simone closed the memorandum and placed it gently on top of the will. We can pause if necessary, she said. Victor looked around the room. At Ruth, who no longer looked certain. At Graham, who had his folder open. At Simone, who had ceased being an attorney and become an obstacle. At me, still sitting, still calm, still not giving him the explosion he needed. And that was when I knew the next phase had arrived. Victor was no longer trying to insult me into shrinking. Victor was trying to figure out how much damage the records could do if he kept talking. Simone did not pause the reading. That mattered. Because pauses invite negotiation. Pauses let families regroup. Soften. Whisper. Reframe. Simone understood what I understood. Once the truth has finally entered the room, the worst thing you can do is hand it back to the people who have spent years surviving by atmosphere. So Simone kept going. Pursuant to Nora Hale's direction, she said, I have already obtained the visitor register, reimbursement ledger, study, inventory archive, and the duplicate keyed file box from Pike and Doyle. Victor's head snapped toward Graham. Not slowly, not subtly. That one movement told the whole story. Graham Pike did not look away. I was instructed to release the duplicate materials only if Elena's appointment was challenged, or Elena's motives were attacked in connection with the estate. Graham said. There it was. Not because I had argued, not because I had demanded, because Victor had done exactly what Nora predicted he would do. He had triggered the reveal himself. Mic drop? Here it is. Victor called Elena greedy, to weaken her before the facts arrived. Instead, he unlocked the facts by saying the exact thing Nora expected him to say. Simone opened a second folder. Inside were copies. Tabbed. Dated. Labeled in Nora's unmistakably neat block handwriting. I knew that handwriting better than my own on some days. Nora labeled things the way some people pray methodically, respectfully, with the assumption that order itself is a form of dignity. Simone lifted the first tab. Visitor log, she said. Then she read selected entries. November 3, Elena, arrived, 8:10 a.m. Pharmacy pickup. Furnace filter, replacement. Lunch prep. Victor, no call. November 17, Elena, present for contractor estimate. Ruth text asking if silver drawer had been sorted. No answer given. December 2, Victor arrived, unannounced, 3:40 p.m. Requested access to study under claim of tax records. Refused. Elena present. December 14, Elena paid emergency plumber deposit. 940美元. Victor said would reimburse. Not received. Each line was small. Ordinary. Deadly. Because that's how real evidence works. It doesn't scream. It accumulates. A decent lie can survive one dramatic allegation. It cannot survive a winter full of timestamps. Ruth tried first. This is selective. Ruth said. This proves nothing except that Nora had preferences. Wrong. That's the kind of argument people make when they are hoping the room is still emotional enough to ignore pattern recognition. Simone didn't even dignify it with eye contact. She moved to the next tab. Reimbursement ledger. Simone said. And then she read amounts. Emergency plumber deposit. Roof tarping after storm damage. 2 insurance premium bridge payments. 1 arborist inspection after a split branch over the garage. Medication copay adjustments when Nora's supplemental coverage lagged. Not gifts. Not grand sacrifices. Just the boring cash flow of actual care. Every line had one of 3 notations beside it. Paid by Elena. Promised by Victor. Unresolved. I didn't need to look at Victor to know what his face was doing. I could hear it in the silence. Because silence changes depending on who now owns the facts. Earlier, Victor's silence had been defensive, noise pressed flat. Now it was vacancy. The sound of a man discovering that other people may have kept better records than he kept excuses. Then Simone moved to the 3rd tab. Inventory variance note. She said, "This one hit harder than even I expected." Because I had known Nora asked me to inventory the study. I had known she distrusted casual access. What I had not known was that she had created a comparison memo after my December photographs. Simone read, "Flat file drawer B2, 1 survey map of Hawthorne parcel missing after Victor December visit. Recovered later in blue recycling bin outside garage." Folded. Ruth gasped. Not politely. Not socially. A real, involuntary sound. Victor stood up again. "That is insane. I never touched any survey map." Simone finally looked at him directly. The item was photographed in place on December 1 and listed missing on December 2. It was recovered December 3. Victor opened his mouth. Closed it. Because that is the problem with lying around physical objects. Objects do not respond well to improvisation. They sit where they sit. Or they do not. Graham added, almost as an afterthought. The parcel survey would have been relevant to a sale inquiry. Not accusation. Just relevance. That was enough. Ruth turned toward Victor with a new face entirely, now not loyal, wife. Not social buffer. A woman doing rapid marital arithmetic. "You told me you never went through her papers?" Ruth said. Victor didn't answer fast enough. That lag was its own confession. Mic drop? Here it is. The 2nd page didn't reveal Elena's hidden power. It revealed Victor's hidden panic around paper. Simone set down the inventory sheet and lifted the final document. "This is Nora Hale's instruction regarding the Hawthorne Preservation Trust Administration," she said. "It names Elena Marlowe as steward and grants Elena full discretion to preserve, restore, archive, lease for approved educational use, or retain the property unsold. It expressly denies any family member veto power. There. The authority. Not symbolic. Not sentimental. Operational. I wasn't just receiving a house. I was receiving control, and Nora had not left that control to chance. She had surrounded it with records, witnesses, and conditions designed to survive exactly the kind of public humiliation Victor had tried to stage at the beginning of the reading. Then Simone read the final paragraph. "In making this arrangement, I am not rewarding affection. I am assigning responsibility to the person who has already been doing the work. If anyone finds Elena's appointment surprising, it is because they confused quiet with weakness." That line landed like a verdict. No one moved. Not Victor. Not Ruth. Not even Graham. Because now Nora had done the one thing no manipulative family system can easily recover from. She had named the central lie aloud. Quiet is not weakness. Service is not hunger. Restraint is not surrender. Victor tried one last time. "This is not normal," he said. "No mother writes a file like this, unless someone poisons her against her own son. Bad move. Too broad. Too desperate. Too late." Simone closed the folder. "No," she said. "A mother writes a file like this when she expects her son to behave exactly as Victor Hale is behaving now." That was the reveal. Not a scream. Not a takedown speech. Not me standing up and finally telling everyone off. Better than that. Authority had spoken, evidence had aligned, logic had closed. And the man who entered the room calling me greedy now had to sit inside a record created by his own mother, proving he had mistaken entitlement for inheritance, access for trust, and volume for power. I still didn't speak. I didn't need to. Because the room no longer belonged to accusation. It belonged to proof. And once proof takes the room, the next thing that usually follows is collapse. The power shift did not feel loud from the inside. That's the part people misunderstand. They imagine a reversal as something cinematic, a speech, a collapse, a final line so sharp it leaves smoke in the air. Real reversals, the ones that hold, are colder than that. They happen when the room stops asking whether you deserve to be heard and starts reorganizing itself around the fact that you were right all along. That was what happened in Simone Kessler's office. Not when Nora's trust was read. Not even when the ledger surfaced. It happened when Victor Hale realized nobody in the room needed his version of events anymore. You could see it in the micro-movements first. Ruth stopped touching his arm. Graham stopped looking at Victor when he spoke. Simone no longer treated Victor as the natural senior family voice to be managed politely through the reading. He became what he had actually become on paper. A possible challenge source, with a bad record and worse timing. And me? I became procedural. That sounds dry. It wasn't. Because in families like mine, the quiet person is tolerated as long as she remains emotional labor. The second she becomes process, she becomes dangerous. Victor tried one final pivot. He sat down slowly, smoothed his tie, and said in a tone he probably thought sounded measured, "Fine. Let's assume Mother wrote what she wrote. That still doesn't mean Elena is capable of administering a historic property. A trust, archive, and all associated liabilities." There it was. A new attack. Cleaner than greed. Competence challenge. Much smarter. Much too late. Because now he was arguing in the only lane where I was strongest. Simone glanced at me. "Would you like me to respond as executor? Or would you prefer to answer?" That question alone marked the reversal. For my entire life in that family, people answered about me. Now the attorney in the room was asking whether I wished to answer for myself or let formal authority do it for me. Mic drop? Here it is. Victor spent years treating Elena like background help. Now an executor was asking Elena which level of authority she wanted to use. I said, "Elena will answer." Then I turned, finally, fully, toward Victor. Not angrily, not theatrically, just directly. Elena has managed conservation budgets, contractor oversight, environmental controls, archival triage, grant compliance, and insurance documentation for collections older than Hawthorne. I said, "Elena also has Nora's full maintenance logs, inventory, archive, vendor history, and the advisory contacts Nora chose. If Victor's concern is competence, Victor is several years too late to raise it." That landed harder than I expected, because I didn't decorate it. Truth sounds more expensive when you don't beg to be believed. Victor opened his mouth. But Graham Pike cut in before he could. "For what it's worth," Graham said, "from a stewardship standpoint, Elena is the only person at this table who's already been acting in continuity with Nora's long-term preservation goals." That was it. That was the line where the floor shifted. Because Graham was not family, not sentimental, not trapped in our mythology. He was external validation. The kind Victor could neither mock nor emotionally absorb. If Simone was legal structure, Graham was practical credibility. And once both of them aligned on the same side of the question, Victor's social power inside the room became ceremonial at best. Ruth knew it before Victor did. Ruth turned toward me and asked, too carefully, "Elena, Are you planning to keep the house? Not can you? Not should you? Not did Nora mean this? Planning. That is how people speak once they realize your authority is real. I answered the same way Nora would have appreciated. Elena is planning to review the trust terms, property condition, and approved use options before making a decision. I said, which is what a steward does. Ruth looked down. Good. Because that sentence did two things at once. It confirmed my control and refused the bait of sentiment. I wasn't the lucky granddaughter clutching a surprise prize. I was the appointed steward evaluating assets, obligation, and use condition. That's the language of adults. That's the language that pushes opportunists out into the cold where they belong. Victor didn't like the cold. You're enjoying this? Victor said. No. And yes. But not in the way he meant. I wasn't enjoying his humiliation. I was enjoying accuracy, finally carrying weight. Still, I didn't explain that to him. Some men are so addicted to drama that if you deny them a petty motive, they'll invent one more flattering to themselves. So I said, Elena is relieved that Nora left records. That one got him. Because Victor knew exactly what relief implied. Not surprise. Not manipulation. Not opportunism. Risk. Relief means there was something to survive. The reading moved forward after that, in a different tone entirely. Simone outlined immediate next steps. Acceptance period. Trust activation, documents. Property access protocol. Archive transfer. And formal notice language, should any party choose to contest. The word contest sounded much smaller now than it had an hour earlier. Not brave. Not forceful. Just expensive and doomed. Then Simone added one more point. Per Nora's written instruction. Effective immediately. All keys. Alarme code. And contractor authorizations associated with Hawthorne are to be transferred solely to Elena Marlowe pending trust administration. Ruth turned to Victor. And there, finally, was the visible collapse. Not sobbing, not shouting, worse, exposure, because Ruth had just realized something Victor must have hidden from her for a long time. He had expected control already. He had assumed he'd continue walking into Hawthorne, opening things, directing people, shaping the story. Losing the house on paper was one thing. Losing access in practice was another. That is when theft, entitlement, and fantasy all suddenly become inconveniently physical. Victor, Ruth said quietly. How many keys do you have? No one in the room moved.